Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Tuesday, December 8th, and we will hear the presentation, Broadband and Planning. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the GoToWebinar tool panel, and I will do my best to help you. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel. We'll answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2020. Thanks to all those participating for making these webcasts possible and free to members. In particular, today we are sponsored by the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration, which is a joint venture of the Maryland National Capital Area, Virginia and West Virginia chapters of APA, along with the Maryland Department of Planning, Maryland Planning Commissioners Association, Rural Planning Caucus of Virginia, and West Virginia's University's Land Use and Sustainable Development Law Clinic. And the intent of this series is to address topics that may be of interest to people involved in planning at all levels across multiple regions, and we've enjoyed having this collaboration. They've had several webcasts throughout the last month or so, and we've enjoyed having you. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our final sessions for 2020. We're already booking into 2021, so be sure to stay tuned. Head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast to register for all of our upcoming sessions. Today's session has been approved for 1 CM credit for live viewing. You can head over to planning.org and log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by the title or the event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage to log those AICP CM credits. And be sure to like us on Facebook, just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. That's where I post any important information like date or time changes when we have a new batch of sessions available for you to register for. So be sure to like us and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Again, just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. We record all of our sessions and post them on our YouTube channel. We have over 300 sessions, over 3,100 subscribers. So be sure to subscribe to us so you get notification when I post a new recording. That, I believe, is it for my housekeeping items. Again, if you have questions, just type them in the chat box and I'll get those all ready for our Q&A at the end of the session. So I'm going to turn it over to Jan Hovis, who is our presenter today. She's going to self-introduce herself and kick things off. Let me turn those controls over to you. And you should now receive that pop-up. Wonderful.
Yes. Let me know when you see my screen.
I do see it. And if you just put it into presentation mode,
yeah,
we'll be good to go.
I'll do that. Just working through the technology here.
If you hit slideshow up at the top,
yeah,
the slideshow tab over to your right.
Yeah, the GoToWebinar is not letting me in. I just need to close out.
We see your screen.
Yeah, I know. It won't let me touch the slideshow. Okay, it's gonna just take me a moment and I will have this together. There we go.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And nice to be with you all. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to share some information about broadband and planning today. I am going to just quickly tell you that I'm Joanne Hovis. I'm from CDC Technology and Energy in Maryland. And it won't give you a lot of background because if you want it, that is what the broadband internet is for, is the good news. Other than to say that I have had the enormous good fortune to have finished school just as the commercial internet was being born in the mid-1990s and to have worked ever since then in the space of approaching from a community and public sector standpoint, strategy and planning around what the future of the broadband internet would be, because it became apparent very early on to so many localities and many states that the broadband internet was going to increasingly be foundational to the workings of our economy and of our democracy as Americans. And the one most significant change of our current moment is that, unlike previous years when the communities that felt this so acutely had to persuade others that it was indeed the case, I think we are in this incredibly important moment where we have national recognition and unanimity on an entirely nonpartisan and bipartisan basis that this infrastructure is entirely foundational, that is going to be part of our path back from pandemic, from all the crises that we're currently facing, both with regard to healthcare and our economy, but also that because it is so foundational to education and healthcare and the various pieces of life that are so significantly constrained in the current moment, it needs to be given that much more attention. So we're in this moment of enormous possibility and opportunity and widespread understanding of the criticality of broadband, and I find that incredibly encouraging. I'm very optimistic about the potential that we as a nation will solve our broadband deficits in the coming decade. I am going to talk really fast because there's so much I'd like to share with you. I'm mostly going to touch on some of the things that I would like to advise you that I think as planners you should be aware of and be knowledgeable of. And I'm going to start with a little bit of technology, explaining how we got to the current moment and why it's important. I promise I will not talk engineering speak. I don't do that. The goal is for planners and policymakers to understand what they need to know about history of technology and technology itself in order to be able to do the kind of work that they need to around broadband. Then I'll speak through best practices of a variety of sorts, but in particular with regard to process and planning for how to undertake and engage and navigate a broadband planning process at the local or regional level. Let me start with just a few thoughts about the enormity and the criticality of broadband as the infrastructure that is entirely critical to just about every element of how our communities function. And when we think about broadband in the current moment, one way to think of it as an area of effort is that it is in many ways a means of creating better outcomes with regard to almost everything that communities care about. It underlies as an infrastructure just about everything we work on: economic activity, democratic discourse, civic engagement, education, healthcare, etc. I'm not going to go into enormous amounts of detail. I just want to share with you that when you're thinking about broadband and you're thinking about the infrastructure components of it and what this foundational infrastructure is, there are really three pieces to understand in terms of what the various elements of the network are that you may, as planners and as communities, be working on. First, the backbone or long haul parts of the network, which are really analogous to the interstate highways and the major highways of the nation. These are the massive trunks of fiber that crisscross the country and that are the backbone of the internet itself. Then the middle mile infrastructure, which at the state level and the regional level connects our major institutions and connects our towns and cities to each other in the local area. And these middle mile routes, usually fiber optics, much like the backbone, think of as analogous to state highways or major local routes. And then the last mile. This is the distribution part of the network. This is analogous to the streets and roads and alleys and even the driveways that are in our network of roads that are the local part of the network. And this last part, the last mile or the local part of the network, is the hardest part to make work economically, the most challenging piece, the biggest deficit that we face as a nation and as individual communities, and is likely to be a big part of the planning process at the local or regional level, even as it fits into that broader regional picture or statewide picture of middle mile and the national picture of backbone or long haul. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about satellites, but I know I always get lots of questions, always these days, particularly with SpaceX launching service on its low Earth orbit satellite network known as Starlink. So I wanted to, as I talk about technology, just fit this into context here so that you all know that we're in another very interesting and critical moment at the current time, in that these low Earth orbit or LEO broadband satellite networks are in the immediate moment just being piloted and tested. In the next 18 months, we will find out just how consequential and impactful they are likely to be. We don't yet know. We don't know that the technologies are sound. We don't yet, frankly, know whether the companies that have these technologies have viable business plans and whether those business plans will work. But we do know that there's enormous promise in that the new generation of satellites, which is low Earth orbit or LEO, as opposed to the geostationary or GEO, are much, much closer to the Earth, which means that their characteristics for propagation of a signal, of an internet signal, are far superior. We believe that the Starlink network, for example, owned by SpaceX, could be delivering speeds of 100 megabits and more, speeds that are comparable to anything that residential consumers would purchase on the open market over terrestrial networks. So an enormous amount of promise here, but no absolute guarantee. Not at least for another couple of years will we really know whether this is what will transform the broadband environment. But I put that into the context here of this graphic for hopefully providing all of you with a little bit of context for understanding what we are talking about when we talk about broadband technologies and how we come to the current moment. The reason I like to share this graphic and the story of this graphic is because I think that taking all the technologies for which you hear all of the jargon so frequently in commercials from the industry, in media, and elsewhere, and putting them into a context is critically important. The essential things to note here are how these technologies relate to each other, and what they mean in terms of how we got to the current moment, and the gaps that reveals that require the planning process as a means of addressing. Now, that sounds remarkably vague. Let me share with you what I really mean by this. This graphic attempts to show you from a technical standpoint the speeds, not looking at other propagation characteristics, but just the speed elements, which is really in many ways the critical element, not the only critical element, but the critical element of a data service or an internet or communications service. And above the line are wireline technologies, below the line are wireless technologies. And the line shows us going from about 50 kilobits per second across to a megabit per second, a megabit being 1,000 times a kilobit, and then over to a gigabit per second, which is 1,000 times a megabit, and then beyond to 10 gigabits, and with the arrow to the right continuing infinitely. Technology is not there yet, but it'll start moving. It's moving all the time. That line shows us speeds, and then the bars on the graphic show us the different technologies and the speeds that they can deliver. But the important thing to note about this particular line as well is that it is in many ways a timeline. That 50 kilobits per second at the far left shows up the beginning of the commercial, shows us the beginning of the commercial internet in the dial-up era at about 54 kilobits per second. In the mid-1990s, as the commercial internet was being born, the vast majority of us connecting to the internet for the very first time, connected over dial-up phone modems over old phone lines that were running, the dial-up modem running communications over those phone lines that had been deployed in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, in some cases in the 1890s, and early 20th century. The dial-up connections were the beginning of the commercial internet in the mid-90s, when it was privatized and commercialized by the federal government. And the explosion of commercial activity and democratic activity that followed came immediately in that time period. And what happened as that explosion of activity on the internet, in that exciting, really remarkable moment that's sometimes called the dot-com era or the telecom boom, what happened in that moment is that a whole lot of companies who hadn't paid a whole lot of attention to the internet as a potential business opportunity started to pay an enormous amount of attention. And what we saw then was effectively a race, a battle between the phone companies. In today's representation, they are CenturyLink, AT&T, Verizon, Frontier. They had somewhat different names, and there were more of them in that era before consolidation, but Bell Atlantic, as an example, Bell South. Those companies using their phone lines and going from dial-up to a new technology that allowed them to go considerably faster, known as digital subscriber line, or DSL. But DSL being constrained in its speeds, as you can see in the graphic, topping out at 50 to 100 megabits, best case scenario, really, even today, as time has changed, DSL topping out at that level because it was a communications technology, a very capable and smart set of protocols developed by engineers for maximizing speeds over those old networks that had been built in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1890s in certain cases, but inherently constrained by that communications medium and its great age and the fact that it had been developed for a completely different purpose, which was phone service 100 years earlier. And for many rural communities, and here's why this matters, right? None of this would matter if it didn't actually have a point in terms of today, but for many rural communities who are served only with DSL, they are lucky to have DSL in that those old phone networks are still there and they can now get internet access over those networks. But the speeds can be very slow, very constrained. Best case scenarios, if they are lucky enough to be located in a certain location and there's good equipment near them, could get up to 50, 30, 20 megabits per second, but they are never going to get to the kinds of speeds that many people who live in metropolitan areas expect. And that limitation inherent to DSL has to do with the old wires, the old infrastructure on which the DSL networks operate, that is the old phone networks. But what was happening in that same time period as DSL was being developed is that the engineers who work for the cable industry were developing a technology known as cable modem or DOCSIS. And I won't go into detail about what that means because it's not at all important, other than to note that there are a few things about cable modem technology that are really critical. As you can see from the graphic, cable modem is capable of much, much faster speeds. In the current moment, most cable modem networks can deliver a gigabit per second in the downstream direction, coming down from the network, so that we receive in our homes or in our offices, as opposed to that we ourselves upload to the network. So much slower speeds uploaded, but very fast speeds download. Why is that? It's not that the engineers are more capable at Cable Labs than they were at Bell Labs, not at all the case. The reason that this was able to get to much faster speeds is that the cable modem was developed to run over cable networks. And unlike the old phone networks, The cable networks were deployed in the 1970s, 1980s, and in some cases in the 1990s. And they made use of a much newer and more robust communications medium known as coaxial cable that was just capable of carrying a lot more traffic than the old phone networks were. They were also deployed originally for one-way video service, right? That's what cable television was. And until the advent of the internet, there was no other purpose for these networks. But in order to enable that one-way television service, they had more capacity and newer infrastructure, as I said. What this means is that cable modem networks are capable of much faster speeds and of much higher, faster, much easier, faster upgrades than the old copper networks carrying DSL. And for planning purposes, the criticality of this is understanding that in your community, wherever there is cable infrastructure, cable television infrastructure that was built all those years ago, 30, 40 years ago, for purposes of one-way video, that network is now capable of delivering very fast internet. And in communities where this infrastructure is ubiquitous, those communities are at a huge advantage relative to their counterparts that don't have it. But cable does not exist in rural areas. Because it was for one-way video service, it was never considered critical infrastructure by the federal government, and there was no universal service mandate at the federal level. So unlike the phone networks, where there was a federal subsidy to deploy those phone networks to 100% of Americans, and almost 100% that was actually successful. Not entirely, because there are places in Indian country where it did not happen, but for the most part, in most of the United States, we have phone networks, and there's some flavor of DSL, even if it's very weak, very old DSL. But cable modem really only exists in our population centers, where there was a business case for a cable network to be built, and the cable companies built those networks. And this puts our rural communities at a huge disadvantage. One more really important point, I think, for planning purposes of understanding cable modem networks is that because these networks were built in order to reach consumers who wanted that one-way video, right? This was all about HBO, right? To a remarkable degree, in fact, it was HBO that drove the economics of these networks being built. The other networks as well, but that was the critical one. Because of that, the application was not an application that was of any interest to businesses. With the exception of sports bars, you really don't have a business need for one-way video service. And as a result, the cable networks, even in the population centers where they got built, in all our cities and towns and suburbs, they were built in residential areas where there was a business for one-way video, but they were not built in small business areas. And even today, this continues to be a real concern, because when the networks became the internet platform of choice, they didn't go to small business areas. And the economics of deploying to small business areas aren't really attractive to the cable television companies. So in many communities, not all, but many, small business areas do not have cable modem infrastructure. They may have access to DSL, but they don't have the better, faster cable modem DOCSIS. Now, large businesses will almost certainly have anything they need. Large businesses, enterprises, big institutional customers, schools, libraries, government, hospitals, etc. For those kinds of customers, there are any number of companies that will build the infrastructure to them because the return makes a lot of sense. But for a small business who can only spend $100 to $150 a month or something in that range, the economics don't make sense for that deployment. And so there is a significant small business gap when it comes to communication services. That should be something that you're thinking about as you're going through this planning process. Two more quick points on this graphic, because I could go on for a long time and I shouldn't, or I will get, well, I lose track of time because there is so much to talk about in this context. But the two other really important things to note. The first one is fiber to the premises, and where does this fit in? Fiber to the premises is the holy grail of communications infrastructure. It is a wire of almost infinite capability and upgradability that goes all the way to the premises, to the user, whether in a home or a business or an institution. And although I think some people think that fiber is a technology, much like my phone or my laptop, that has a limited life and that will be replaced by some kind of a technology innovation, the way to understand fiber is that it is an infrastructure. It is an infrastructure of enormous capabilities. It's not a technology that's going to get changed out every few years or even every few decades. It is an infrastructure that will have a lifetime of many, many decades and will be the platform for all kinds of technology innovations that we can't anticipate right now. In the same way that the infrastructure of cable was not anticipated as supporting the broadband internet 40 years down the road, and the infrastructure of phone networks, when it was being developed in the 1880s and 1890s, never anticipated the uses we make of it now. Fiber is an infrastructure that is very much of the future and is an infrastructure asset rather than a technology or a gadget. And that's an important point. Fiber to the premises has been deployed in some select parts of the country. Unfortunately, still a pretty modest fraction of the country. But it is the logical upgrade for all of these other networks where the economics make it feasible. And in some very fortunate communities where Verizon, for example, invested in upgrading those DSL networks to fiber to the premises, there is this robust infrastructure. In certain very rural areas, there is a federal program, or there are multiple federal programs that subsidize the construction of fiber to the premises. But for most communities throughout the country, where most of our population lives, it is very challenging to make a business case for fiber to the premises given the huge upfront cost and the relatively modest short-term returns. The returns of communications infrastructure are really very long-term relative to other kinds of investments. This is one of the reasons why public entities are actually a very logical entity to work on the infrastructure elements of this, is because this is a long-term investment as opposed to a very short-term investment. And we still have this massive gap in substantial parts of the United States where these other communications, infrastructures, and services may exist to some degree or another, maybe even in a robust way in the form of cable modem. But this enormously important infrastructure that is fiber to the premises has not yet materialized. And figuring out how to go from the cable modem infrastructure and create the economics feasible to upgrade that, or to build a new fiber to the premises network, or work with a phone company to upgrade the old copper DSL networks to fiber to the premises, that is in many ways at the heart of any planning process that has to do with broadband. Here's the second point regarding this slide that I promised I would make, and it is for below the line. What do we know about wireless below the line? And this is the critical point. When we look at that line that shows 3G and 4G and then goes into 5G, which is in the very, very early stages of deployment now and only in very limited areas of the United States, totally unproven thus far, but enormously promising in terms of the potential speeds. The thing to know about 3G, 4G, but particularly 5G, is that these very fast speeds will only be feasible in an environment where there is a lot of fiber. Another way of putting this is below the line terrestrial infrastructure is entirely dependent on above the line infrastructure. The wireless connection that goes from my phone, right here from my mobile phone, and connects me to the backbone of the internet and allows me to call someone across the country, that wireless connection is probably less than 1/8 of a mile, depending on where I am located. And in some cases, maybe 1/4 mile, but probably not a whole lot more than that. And then it connects at an aggregation point, likely to be on a tower. It aggregates with, it connects to the backbone of the network and travels over a wire from where I am on the East Coast of the United States to, hypothetically, the West Coast of the United States, where my daughter is in school, she may be talking to me on her mobile phone. And so we may both be on a wireless device, but I am an eighth of a mile away from the wire that sends the transmission to California, and she is an eighth of a mile away from the wire that brings that transmission to her. The great majority of the network will be wired. The great majority of any wireless network is wired, and the closer the wire is to the user or to the device, the better the service will be. What does this mean? It means that for really robust 5G to realize the promise of fast wireless, we're going to need a lot of wires. And this is why communities that have fiber to the premises or have fiber deep into the neighborhood, as much of it as possible, will be better positioned not just for wireline service, but also for wireless. And that in some ways is one of the most important things to know as you go through the planning process. It's that wireless is an overlay on top of a wired network. And the more robust your wired network is, the better your wireless will be. And these things go hand in hand. And so achieving one will likely lead to the other as well. But you're going to start with the fiber because it is the foundation. Okay. In the interests of making sure that I'm not running through all the time, let me move on to another slide and sharing just a couple more insights, and then we'll talk about process for a few minutes, and then I'm really looking forward to some questions. What does all this mean in practical impact in terms of the experience that you might be having on the network? And this is, it occurs to me, this is probably a somewhat dated application, but if you think about downloading or uploading a 5 gigabyte file to or from the network, and 5 gigabytes is about the equivalent of the amount of data you would need for uploading or downloading a DVD of a movie, let's say a 2-hour movie. This is about what you would be looking at. 3G wireless networks, which are still in much of the rural parts of the country, the best you would find, would be measured in terms of download time at more than 10 hours. Over a 4G wireless network, it could be just over an hour. A DSL network, a really robust DSL network, coming close to 2 hours. Now we get to cable modem, and you see the power of cable modem measured in minutes, and fiber measured in seconds. The consequences here are really profound. And maybe for a DVD, it's not so important, but for someone who backs up their home-based business that is run over a laptop on a daily basis because they've got all of their business files on a laptop and they want to back it up to the cloud, this is pretty consequential. For a homeschooling family that needs to download large amounts of video that are utilized as part of the homeschooling curriculum, this is enormously consequential. And in the current moment, with so many of us working from home, learning from home, searching for jobs from home, and in many cases receiving healthcare services from home, you can see the significance of these different speeds. Again, speaking only to speeds here, not to other factors that are critical elements of the experience, such as latency. As you go through the process, and you know, what can we understand about best practices for how to go through a rigorous and robust planning process that enables your community, your entity, your region to really undertake this in a way that is data-based, thoughtful, strategic, most importantly, and I think most critical to any kind of planning process, really actionable. And in a grossly oversimplified way, let me share this as a methodology for understanding at least a high-level framework for how you might want to go through a planning process. And I speak the language of broadband planning. you may have different terms of arts in the broader planning world, but I trust that you will just take my use of broadband related language and adapt it accordingly based on your own needs. So how do we recommend starting this process? With the understanding, by the way, that for most communities, what the goal they have for this kind of a program is that they will address their broadband deficits, significantly impact them, but not in a way that the community itself becomes an internet service provider. There are some who are interested in doing that, and this process will work for them as well with a few tweaks to the process. There are some who are interested in building and owning the infrastructure, but not being an internet service provider. And this process absolutely works for that. But for many, what they're really interested in is developing a strategy that enables partners, usually private sector partners, to address their broadband needs, where the community's own process and planning is designed to tip what would otherwise be a challenging or unattractive business opportunity for a partner into something that is attractive and that is viable, in part because of grants, in part because of financial commitments perhaps, or just otherwise through understanding the market. So with that as a framework, there's a public sector broadband effort, there's a public sector infrastructure model with private sector broadband and services, or there's a purely private model with public support. Under any of those, and the many variations of those three big areas for here based in best practices. And to interest
It looks like we just lost our presenter. Isn't that funny, considering our topic today? Folks, just give us 1 second and let's see if we can't get her back on the line. Folks, if you have questions, again, type them in. We have a couple here. Hopefully we'll be able to get her back on. Oh, I think she's here.
Hi, I can hear you.
Okay.
Are you hearing me all right?
Yes,
Okay.
we can hear you.
Okay.
You disappeared on us.
It's really astonishing. By the way, am on a cable modem connection, so it should be more robust than that. I'm going to keep my webcam off in the hopes that that will stop this from happening again. And when we get to questions and answers, I'll return to the webcam if that's okay.
That's perfect. We do need you, though, if you could share your screen.
You're not seeing the screen. All right.
Oh, now we are. Yep, I see it now. Thank you.
All right. All right. Thank you. Please also let me know. I'm not sure what the last thing you heard was, and I apologize to everyone for the connectivity issues. Even in 2020, in a major metropolitan area, this is something that we unfortunately face all the time. Where I was when I think I lost connectivity is that I was talking about this best practice-based approach to sharing of data. And checking in one last time, are you hearing me okay now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So in this graphic, what you can see is that there are 3 different colors, and this is just a simplified way of understanding different functions and tasks. The blue is for data collection mechanisms. The green is engineering or technical tasks, and the orange is business or financial tasks. And I will just very briefly say that one, of course, wants to start with data, and you start with developing as much information as possible about requirements, goals, and priorities that will then serve as understanding where are our gaps, what are we really missing, and what are our priorities with regard to them? What is it we're trying to accomplish through this effort? That means outreach to a wide range of different stakeholders and a lot of different kinds of data collection. But at its core, one wants to start with that. What is the challenge that we're trying to address, and how do we understand it relative to the other priorities? How do we understand the elements of it? There's also a technical data collection mechanism, which is understanding and mapping what is served, what is unserved, and what do we consider to be inadequately served or underserved, so that we know what are the gaps from an infrastructure standpoint and what are we trying to address. Once we know what those gaps are, a technical task around understanding what will it take to fill the gaps. What is the total cost of addressing that, the problems that we've identified in our communities, not just the capital cost, but also the operating cost, so that we have a total cost of ownership. And what is the order of magnitude that it's going to entail? Is this a number that is in the 7 figures? Is it in the 8 figures? Like, what exactly is the enormity of the task before us expressed in dollars? Because broadband infrastructure and services is really a problem that can be solved with dollars. This is a good thing in many ways. We know we can buy our way out of this problem if there is money available. That, of course, is a big if, although this feels like it is a very good moment in terms of federal funding for broadband, if nothing else. And then all of that data allows one to do planning and build financial models around understanding the economics of what it would take to address these gaps. What's it going to cost to build? What's it going to cost to finance and operate? And then what are the likely revenues and other ways of understanding financial value, so that we know what the return or the payback on this might look like from a community standpoint and from a private sector standpoint, which is data that's very, very useful as we then move into building partnership strategy, outreach to the private sector, outreach to the potential partners to understand what is it that they would be looking for? What is the partnership in our community or region going to look like? And which part of these gaps would they be willing to fill? And what would they look to us on the public sector side to support with, if indeed they are interested in these markets? Market and demand research help to quantify what the market opportunity is, which is obviously an important input to the financial and business planning, but also a really important input to the discussions with partners in order to help them to understand where the opportunity is. And as I said before, that discussion with partners might be, well, here's a community that has a broadband infrastructure itself in the form of wireless towers or conduit or some fiber optics, or wants to build quite a bit more of that sort of thing. Is the private sector interested in becoming a service provider over that public infrastructure, or would it be interested in building it itself with some public support and help of various sorts, perhaps economic development incentives or anchor tenancy commitments to buy services, or support by the public entity of a federal grant strategy? That gets us into the finance and grant strategy. But there is definitely opportunity through multiple particular. And building out that strategy and building that strategy for what the collaboration with that private partner looks like leads to a business plan and a full execution strategy. I'm hoping that you are all still hearing me and worried that the connectivity issues might have gotten in the way.
We can hear you.
Excellent. Then my laptop is telling me all kinds of things that I should be concerned about. I actually have more slides on process, but I think given the time, I am going to stop, and I will happily provide all of these slides if they are useful, because there's more content there. But in the meantime, and given the hour, I very much look forward to questions. And I will turn my webcam back on and hope that we don't have connectivity problems.
Great. And yes, I'll ask Joanne that you just send me a PDF copy of your presentation as soon as we're done here, and we'll post that on our webcast webpage. You'll just search Ohio Planning, or I'm sorry, just go to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So let's just jump into a couple questions. We have about 10 minutes here. The first question is, my community borders the Navajo Nation, where many people lack basic services. So how can broadband be implemented in areas like this?
Yeah, that's an enormously important question. I've actually spent considerable time working on broadband issues in Arizona and in New Mexico, in areas bordering the Navajo Nation. The core issue, I think, to understand about broadband in those areas and so many very rural areas of the United States is that, like all infrastructure, there is just an economic impossibility to this serving as an investment that will pay for itself. We don't expect roads to pay for themselves. And in rural parts of the United States, we don't expect water systems to pay for themselves. We don't expect power systems to pay for themselves. We've made a national commitment as Americans that we will subsidize these forms of infrastructure in parts of the country where the economics simply won't work otherwise. That is why we have phone networks all over the country, not because the economics worked, but because we made a commitment to universal service. And we're going to have to do the same thing in broadband. I think that process is taking place. I think federal support is growing and federal funding is growing pretty considerably. I can speak in more detail about what that looks like and what I think might be coming in the next few years, if you like. But I think the thing to understand in the parts of the country that you're talking about is that we have this combination of very high capital costs and relatively modest potential revenues. And the reason the revenues are modest is because we've got very low population density, and in some cases also may have very or relatively low income levels, which means that there's not a lot of disposable income for buying the kinds of service that make a communications network viable, like lots of add-ons of cable television and phone service. Economics are problematic. And there will almost certainly be a state role. And I know that both Arizona and New Mexico are states that are considering grant programs. There's one in Arizona at the moment that's kind of modest that could be expanded. Colorado has a very substantial one. Nevada has a modest size one. This is something that is growing in just about every state. As you think about planning in the area where you're located, potentially think of a model that looks at local, state, and federal inputs, a partnership among all levels of government and the private sector. And the combination of federal and state funds, local support, and some private sector investment, but also private sector risk-taking, I think is probably the totality of what it would take to bridge the very substantial gaps in your area.
Thank you. There's a couple questions related to ROWs and easements. So let's kind of dig in there a little bit. The first one is, one of the largest stumbling blocks is access to easements and in right-of-ways, should localities prioritize access to these areas as where to install broadband infrastructure? So let's kind of start there and work our way.
So, there's an awful lot in that. There's so many pieces to this. I would say this is going to look different from community to community. And in some cases, the challenges are getting access to public property. In some cases, it's private property. And then I will add, when it's public property, it's unbelievably challenging getting access to federally controlled public property. State is a bit easier and local is a bit easier than that. But federal in particular, to respond to the person who asked a question about the situation in the West near the Navajo Nation, federal can be incredibly challenging because there might be multiple federal agencies involved in reviewing rights of way, permit obligations, or opportunities and requirements in certain areas. So yes, this is an area that needs to be addressed. I will say, based on my own experience, that localities tend to be very creative about this. It's an area that is worth paying attention to because as a public entity, this is one of the things you can impact without spending a whole lot of money, is to maximize processes, permits, access, and so on, and to do it in a way that does not compromise public interest needs or public assets. That is entirely doable. But what I have found is that just observing this market and participating in it for a long time, local entities in particular will be very creative and will work very hard on this when the opportunity arises. If there is a private sector entity that says we want to build broadband, most local entities will knock themselves out to try to meet the requirements of that, that private potential partner. And I think that is worthwhile, but I think it's important to note that you can do it without compromising your own assets. I know that seems very vague. There's lots of detail around what it might look like in regard to lots of different kinds of assets and permissions and permitting processes. And it's not the magic solution to anything. It's simply not a magic bullet. But what it does is it improves, at the margins, it will improve the economics of a deployment, and it will speed up a deployment, and that is why it is worth putting the effort into. And just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into a lot more detail, but I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and you actually ended up answering another one of the questions. So let's just switch gears real quick and answer one more question, and that is, how do we make sure that the physical internet isn't ugly? How do we do it?
Well, that's a really intriguing way to pose that question. I guess ugly is to some degree in the eye of the beholder.
It looks like we lost you again. You're frozen in time. It looks like we lost you. And you make the case for better internet. I think we're at 2 o'clock anyway, so I think we'll wrap up. And hopefully we can have her back on again for a longer period of time. Because there are a lot of really great questions, and I personally have like 10 questions. So hopefully we'll have her back. So thank you if you can hear us for joining us today, Joanne. And thank you also to our sponsor today. And hopefully, like I said, we'll have her back on, and we'll have a PDF of the presentation available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and we'll also have this recorded up on our YouTube channel. So again, thank you to the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration for putting this together, and hopefully we can have her back on again for a longer period of time, because she has a lot of really great and interesting information to share with us about this topic, which is obviously very timely. So everyone, thanks again for joining us. Visit our webcast webpage to register for all of our upcoming sessions, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Thanks everyone. Have a good one, and we'll talk next time.